feel like this thing. Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarvadharma swarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishna te namaha. We bow down with humility and reverence to Sri Ramakrishna, the establisher of righteousness, the essence of all religions, and the greatest of divine incarnations. Good morning, everyone. There's a bit of a coincidence that the annual meeting for the Vedanta Society is going on right now. So it's possible that some people who would have attended today's talk are currently watching the online meeting. But it's nice actually to have a more intimate group. And another thing I should mention is that I was in Tokyo last week for about 8 days attending an academic conference on the problem of evil and suffering. It was wonderful. It was at Waseda University, and I gave a lecture there, and I met a lot of interesting scholars from different faith traditions. The reason I mention is because since coming back, I've had a bit of a stomach flu, so I'm not feeling great. And if I run off in the middle of the lecture, you'll know why. But I hope that in the midst of speaking of Vedantic themes, I might transcend body consciousness, but I may have to tend to the body. All right, so that's a disclaimer. Okay, regarding the title of my talk, as it's listed on the bulletin, it's same goal, different paths. But as I reflected on the topic, I thought that it would be better to make a slight modification of the title and add a question mark at the end of the title. Same goal, different paths, question mark? That's really what the talk is going to be about today. Because many of you are longtime devotees, some of you are initiated devotees, and you might be thinking, what does he have to say that's new? He's preaching to the choir, tell me something I don't know. We all know that Sri Ramakrishna taught as many faiths, so many paths, Jato Mot, Toto Pot. What's new about that? We're already on board. Well, I hope that I'm going to raise at least one, if not more, issues, questions, challenges that you either haven't thought about with respect to the harmony of religions or haven't thought about as deeply as maybe you should. So I want to start out in a bit of a different way. I want to start by raising some difficult questions about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on the harmony of religions. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to raise these difficult questions without answering them. I want you to think about how you might answer them for yourselves, each one of you. I'm going to ask the question, then think about it yourself. Second part of my talk, I'm going to go into some of the details of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. And in the third and final part of the talk, I'm going to give my tentative, provisional answers to the questions that I'm about to raise. And then in the Q&A, hopefully I'll hear from you about how you might answer the same question. You might say, well, Swami, I think your answer to question 2 is not as good as it could be. Here's my response. And that would be wonderful. So I'd like to hear from you as well. This should be more of a kind of interactive session, I hope. But let's keep the interaction for the end, maybe. Unless I ask for it. Okay, so what are these questions? Let's begin. Question number 1. Sri Ramakrishna says again and again that all the different faith traditions, all the different religious paths lead to the same goal. But one difficult question is, how can that be true? Because different religions seem to teach different goals. For Christianity, the goal is Christian heaven. For Islam, the goal is a Muslim heaven, which is not the same as a Christian heaven. It's called Jannah. For Hindu theistic traditions of Hinduism, the goal is residing in some kind of transcendental loka, but there are many different kinds of loka. There's Vishnu loka, there's Goloka, there's Ramakrishna loka for Ramakrishna devotees. For Advaita Vedantins, the goal is not going anywhere or staying anywhere at all. There's no going and coming, as Shankara puts it. There's just resting in your Swarupa, your own true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. For Buddhists, the goal is nirvana. Aren't they different goals? That's the first challenging question. I'm not the first to raise this question. In fact, a critic of Sri Ramakrishna, some of you may have heard of this person. He's an American Hindu priest named Frank Morales. He has a Hindu name, but I don't know what it is. Anyway, he published under the name Frank Morales a book in 2008 called, little booklet maybe we can say, called Radical Universalism, does Hinduism teach that all religions are the same? And his answer is an emphatic no. It's a polemical treatise, we can say, and really attacking our tradition. And he raises the following objection. He says, there are several radically distinct and wholly irreconcilable religiously inspired ideas about what constitutes the absolute. Consequently, rather than attempting to artificially claim that there is only one mountaintop toward which all religions aspire, which is exactly Sri Ramakrishna's view, or seems to be, it would be more truthful and more in keeping with what the various religious traditions themselves actually say, to state that there are several different mountains, each representing a radically different idea of what is the absolute. There is a Nirvana mountain, a Brahman mountain, an Allah mountain, a Jaina mountain. Some mountains are monotheistic, some are polytheistic, henotheistic, pantheistic, or panentheistic. Moreover, it is incumbent upon us all individually to choose for ourselves which of these many possibly correct absolute mountains we wish to scale. Only one of these mutually exclusive philosophical mountains, however, can be the correct one. That's the challenge, the first big challenge to Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. And other critics have also raised this issue. I think he raised it in a very strongly worded way, which I think is useful for get our brain to be working. And how would we defend Sri Ramakrishna against this kind of objection? It's the first serious question. Think about it for yourselves, and then at the end of the talk, toward the end of the talk, I'll suggest my answer. Second challenging question. Sri Ramakrishna seems to say, that all religious paths lead to the same goal. But what about religiously inspired terrorist organizations? What about ISIS? What about Al-Qaeda? What about Aum Shinrikyo? I was just in Tokyo and there was a talk on Aum Shinrikyo, which is this terrorist organization responsible for murdering people, which was inspired by Hinduism and Buddhism. So does Sri Ramakrishna say these are also paths? These terrorist religious groups are also paths to the same goal? Why or why not? And if we want to say, no, of course not, that's crazy. But on what grounds does Sri Ramakrishna, or a follower of Sri Ramakrishna, on what grounds can we exclude these religiously inspired terrorist groups from counting as a genuine religion? That's the second big question, okay? So the danger here is, if we say all religions lead to the same goal, there's a danger of being too inclusive. We don't want to include terrorists, right? Presumably. All right. Third challenging question. This is a serious question. It's raised all the time in the context of what's called religious pluralism. It's a big topic now in the philosophy of religion and in theology, because there are a number of philosophers and theologians who actually defend positions similar to Sri Ramakrishna's, that multiple religions have what's called equal salvific efficacy, which means that they're equally capable of taking us to the same goal of salvation. The problem is, a lot of critics of religious pluralism, they say, what about conflicting religious truth claims? What about, how do you account for the fact that different religions sometimes make conflicting claims that conflict with the claims of other religions? Let me give you two simple examples. One is, did Christ die on the cross? Let's say it's obvious, of course he died on the cross. Well, Christians agree that Christ died on the cross, but you know who doesn't agree? Muslims. The Quran does not accept that Christ died on the cross. They don't accept that Christ was an incarnation, that Christ was the Son of God. They say he was a prophet. But so there are many conflicting claims. Muslims say that Christ did not die on the cross. Christians say Christ did die on the cross. Another example, are we reborn? Hindus, Buddhists, Jainas, Sikhs, they say, yes, we are reborn. This is not our first birth. But what about Abrahamic religions? Christianity, Judaism, Islam, they don't accept rebirth. So how would a follower of Sri Ramakrishna or Sri Ramakrishna himself or Swami Vivekananda, how do they account for the fact that different religions sometimes directly conflict with each other, are at loggerheads in different claims? And how can they say that all religions are equally valid paths to the same goal if different religions say radically different things about the nature of ultimate reality, about historical facts, about whether Christ died on the cross, about metaphysical truths, like whether the fact that we're reborn or not, whether there's a theory of a doctrine of karma, a law of karma, okay? But examples can be multiplied of different conflicting claims in different world religions. That's the third challenging question. Fourth challenging question. This is a big matzo ball. If any of you have watched Seinfeld, there's an episode about matzo balls. So matzo ball means this is like a big kind of like, it's a sort of elephant in the room question that especially Vedantins, they sort of try to sidestep this issue, but it's an important one that you should that I think we should try to tackle head on. It's the question of Buddhism. Where do we place Buddhism and how do we accommodate Buddhism within our framework for harmonizing the world religions? The problem for Vedanta, for Vedantic doctrines of the harmony of religions like Sri Ramakrishna's, like Swami Vivekananda's, is the following. And I'm going to go into this in more detail later, but I'm just going to explain it briefly now. The goal is usually explained in one of two ways from a Vedantic standpoint. One is there's a kind of theistic heaven where you can dwell in a loving relationship with the personal God. That can accommodate all the theistic religions of the world. There's also a kind of impersonal sort of goal. You can call it resting in your true nature, whatever you want to say. It's just recognizing or realizing your true nature as pure consciousness. But Buddhism, arguably, or at least some schools of Buddhism, don't accept either ideal. Some schools of Buddhism don't accept any kind of heaven. Some schools of Buddhism also don't accept the reality of some kind of non-dual self, or at least, yeah. And so in that case, they wouldn't accept the Advaitic ideal either. So then how does Sri Ramakrishna accommodate Buddhism within the fold of the harmony of religions? Or is it not a valid path? So this is the fourth challenging question. So I think I'm going to stop there. There are many more challenging questions. Those we could just keep going on all day with challenging questions, but I'm going to stop with four. And hopefully I'll have time to present my answers to all four of them. So, but that's enough to get you thinking. So now, let me get into my understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions. And then, as I said, toward the end of the talk, I'll try to answer the questions that I've raised. So when you study the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the thing is that his teachings are scattered in different places. His teachings on the harmony of religions are scattered on different pages. He says different things in different places to different people in different contexts. So one thing that's really important is that we try to get a more philosophically rigorous understanding of his teachings on the harmony of religions as a whole by trying to bring these different teachings together in a coherent way. Okay. To help us, I think it's useful to bring in what's called a threefold typology, introduced by the philosopher Alan Race. In 1983, it's become a very influential typology, and it'll help us, I think, in kind of placing different attitudes with respect to the world religions. So the first category, it's called exclusivism. This is the view that only one religion can lead to salvation. Every other religion is not capable, no other religion is capable of taking us to salvation. That's exclusivism. The second position is called inclusivism. This is the view that my religion is the highest or the best religion. It's best equipped to take us to salvation. Other religions aren't completely hopeless. They're not completely wrong. They're not completely futile, but they can only take us part of the way to the highest goal, or they can bring us to kind of lesser goals, but they're not as good as my religion. So there's always, in inclusivist attitudes, there's always a kind of higher and lower. My religion is the best. Other religions aren't completely wrong, but they're lower than mine. They're stepping stones toward my highest religion, my highest standpoint. We're going to find a bit later, I'll mention this specifically, that you'll find an inclusivist view even within Hinduism. Do you know what that is? There are many, but one of the most popular inclusivist positions within Hinduism.
ISKCON?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
ISKCON is an interesting suggestion. I would almost say it's more exclusivist, but I mean, or maybe it straddles the border between exclusivism and inclusivism. In fact, I just wrote a chapter. It's being recorded, but it won't be uploaded, right? Okay, so I was writing a chapter on Sri Ramakrishna and Vaishnavism. And in the course of my research, I wanted to see what Prabhupada says about Ramakrishna mission, about Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. And in the 70s, he would go on morning walks, which were recorded. So they're audio recordings and they're online. You can get them all. And so in one of these morning talks, somebody asked him, a disciple or devotee asked him, what do you think about Ramakrishna mission, these modern Hindu movements? He says, oh, Ramakrishna mission, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, Mahesh Yogi, all bogus. So that's not higher and lower. It's just bogus. I mean, it's and he literally says, I quote this paragraph. He says, all bogus, Vivekananda bogus. All modern Hindu movement separate from ISKCON, separate from, different from anything other than Chaitanya's path is bogus. And he used the word bogus about 6 times in that paragraph. And he says the only path that will lead to the highest goal is the path chalked out by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Everything else is completely useless. So I would say that's more exclusivistic. Inclusivist, any other guesses? Within Hinduism, an inclusivist paradigm within Hinduism. One more guess and then I'll...
Honestly, I'd say us.
Okay, good. That's it. I like the provocative suggestion here.
Sorry.
What about us?
Depending on the speaker.
That's very good. I think you're right, actually. Depending on the monk that you happen to get on the Sunday talk or Saturday talk. There are some monks in our order who do teach Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions in an inclusivist way. And I'm going to try to explain why some of us make that, I think, a mistake. And I'm going to argue that there's a better way to understand, in a more liberal way of understanding Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's teachings. But just to kind of break the suspense here, probably the most hegemonic tradition within Hinduism, Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Yeah, exactly. That's a very good example of an inclusivist paradigm. It's not to put it down. It's a statement of facts, as Swami Vivekananda used to say about Maya. I'll explain later how it's inclusivist, but the basic gist is theistic religions, bhakti traditions, can only take us part of the way according to Advaita Vedanta, because the personal God is not ultimately real. And so ultimately, even bhaktas have to leave off their bhakti practices and finally practice jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, and then realize the highest goal, which is not any kind of eternal heaven. That's a lower goal, but resting in their true nature as pure consciousness. Okay, so third paradigm. Oh, and of course, we can come up with all sorts of examples of inclusivism in non-Hindu traditions. One good example is Karl Rahner, a famous German Catholic theologian from the 20th century, who had this wonderfully liberal idea of anonymous Christians. And so he would say that non-Christians, so whether they're Hindus, Buddhists, or Muslims, they're what he calls anonymous Christians. They're Christians without knowing it. And so by the universal grace of Christ, even non-Christian heathens will be saved. But of course, it's still better to be a Christian.
So most religions are like that.
Yeah.
In Baha'i faith.
Yeah. Baha'i is interesting. I mean, we'll have to talk. I mean, that's a kind of separate lecture, but yeah.
That's my experience.
Yeah.
Almost. Even
Yeah.
academics, we've talked about professors who.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, Francis Clooney is the head of our Hindu monastics program, and he openly says, I'm a Catholic inclusivist, because that's the official position of the Catholic Church. So yeah, and there are many Hindu traditions which are inclusivist. I think what's distinctive and unique and absolutely crucial to our tradition is that we're not inclusivist, that we're much more liberal than that we're actually pluralist. That's the third paradigm. This is the view that, let's scrap all this talk of higher and lower. Multiple religious paths are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal. Okay? So, in my talk today, I'm going to make the case that Sri Ramakrishna was a religious pluralist. He was not an inclusivist. He was not an exclusivist. I think we can all agree he was not an exclusivist. But as you point out, rightly, there's controversy within our order, within our own tradition, about whether we should interpret Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda as religious inclusivists or as religious pluralists. And I'm going to defend a pluralist interpretation. And I've done it in much greater detail, in more rigor in my publications. So if you're interested in more details, please look at chapter 3 of Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, published in 2018, and chapter 3 of the book published last year, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism. So his doctrine of the harmony of religions, I think, is crucially grounded in a very unique and expansive form of spiritual experience, which he calls Vijnana. This is how he explains the spiritual stages of Jnana and Vijnana. So Jnana means knowledge. Vijnana means a kind of deeper, richer, or more intimate knowledge of God. He says, this is all taken from the gospel. The Jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes, or she realizes, that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof: bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all of its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is impersonal, nirguna is the original Bengali term, is also personal, saguna. This is known as Vijnana. Leaving the steps behind one by one to reach the roof signifies the path of Advaita Vedanta. Brahman is not this world, Brahman is not this body, Brahman is not this mind, until you reach the roof. The roof signifies Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is the highest goal for Advaita Vedantins. It's in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi that you rest in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. But Sri Ramakrishna says that's not the end of spiritual life. There's a further stage, which not everybody is able to attain. Some people will leave their body in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi within 21 days, as he says. But there are some special divinely commissioned souls, which he calls Ishvarakotis, whom he calls Ishvarakotis, who are able, after reaching the roof, which means after attaining knowledge of non-dual Brahman, and feeling that this entire world is a dream, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, they're able to come back to this world, and then what they see is startling. They see that, wait a minute, the stairs are made of the same material as the roof. Just as the roof was made of brick lime, and brick dust, the stairs are made of the same stuff, which means, what does that mean? It's a metaphor, but the idea is, this world is nothing but God. It's not that the world is unreal, the world is a real manifestation of Shakti. And the Vijnani realizes that the infinite divine is impersonal in one aspect, in its static aspect. That's non-dual pure consciousness, which the Jnani realizes in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but that doesn't exhaust the nature of the infinite divine. The infinite divine is equally Shakti, the dynamic personal God, which creates, preserves, and destroys this universe. And that Shakti manifests as every name and form we see in this world, including our own bodies, including the chairs that you're sitting on, including the keyboard, the podium. So that's Vijnana. So whereas the Jnani will tend to dismiss this world as unreal, as an illusion, as a dream, the Vijnani embraces this world as a mansion of mirth, as Sri Ramakrishna used to put it, Mojakuti. How can he not be joyful? How can the Vijnani not be joyful? Because the Vijnani sees nothing but God in everything. Divine bliss everywhere, right? There are deep similarities with Kashmiri Shaivism here as well. So, to sum up, Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta, the two doctrines which are most relevant to our purposes today, which are about the harmony of religions, are the following. What is the nature of ultimate reality? According to Sri Ramakrishna, the ultimate reality is impersonal in one aspect and personal in another aspect. And the personal aspect, Shakti, can manifest in many different forms. Christ, Krishna, Ganesha, you name it. And the second key doctrine here for our purposes is that all four of the yogas, the standard yogas which most of you are probably familiar with, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, Karma Yoga, the yoga of selfless action, Raja Yoga, the yoga of concentration and meditation, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge. All of these are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal. What's the logic? Actually, it's pretty simple. You can just derive Doctrine 2 from Doctrine 1. How? One of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings holds the key. One of my favorites. Tini ananto patho ananto. Tini ananto means God is infinite. Patho ananto means the paths are also infinite. And the beauty of this teaching is that Sri Ramakrishna is explaining why or how the paths to God are infinite. Why are there infinite paths to God? Because God himself or God herself is infinite. Such an elegant argument, actually, philosophical argument. So more concretely, because God is infinite and God is impersonal in one aspect, that means that followers of the path of knowledge can reach the ultimate because they're interested in attaining the impersonal dimension of the infinite. Advaita Vedantins want Brahman, Buddhists want Nirvana. We'll get to the complications with Buddhism later. But in any case, and what about bhaktas? Where does it leave devotees of the personal God, Christians and Muslims and Brahma Samaj followers and Vaishnavas and a million other bhaktas of different traditions? They're interested in the personal God, but that's equally real. The personal God is also another equally real aspect of the same infinite divine reality. So he very elegantly and very rigorously derives the harmony of religions from this very expansive understanding of God, of the infinite divine as both personal and impersonal. And both those aspects are equally real. Now, he uses, this is very much in the manner of Christ, for instance. Christ would often teach with parables. Sri Ramakrishna would also teach with parables. And especially in the context of the harmony of religions, he was fond of teaching two parables. One is the chameleon, the other is the blind man and the elephant. You probably are familiar with them, but I'm going to mention briefly. The chameleon, there's a chameleon on a tree. And a person walks up to the tree, sees, wow, there's a beautiful yellow chameleon. Let me go back and tell my friends. Goes back to tell his friends, it's a great yellow chameleon, go check it out. Friend number 2 goes, let's say 15 minutes later. And he says, I don't see a yellow chameleon, but I see a blue chameleon. Comes back, starts arguing with his friend. Why'd you lie to me? What are you, pulling my chain? It's a blue chameleon, it's not yellow. Third one goes, sees it as red. And then they start fighting with each other under the tree. And then there's somebody who comes, who intervenes. There's a person sitting under this tree who witnessed the whole thing. And he says, wait a minute, stop your bickering. I live under this tree and I'm here to tell you that you're all right. Because it's a chameleon and it changes colors. So the moral of this, from the standpoint of the harmony of religions, there are a few morals. Number one, what do the different colors of the chameleon represent? Different forms of the personal God. Red could be Jesus, yellow could be Allah, whatever. And okay, that's I slightly misspoke there because Islam doesn't believe in forms of God. They believe in the personal but formless God. But just for, if we want to use this parable, we can say that Allah corresponds to one of these colors, maybe, even though it's formless but personal. But what about Advaita Vedanta? That corresponds to the colorless chameleon, the chameleon without color, and maybe even Buddhism, right? Does it make sense to say that the colorless chameleon is somehow more real, more authentic than the chameleon in any particular color? No, they're equally real, right? Equally the chameleon. Likewise, the personal God is as real as the impersonal non-dual Brahman. So that's one important lesson from this parable. Second lesson, who is this mysterious person sitting under the tree? First of all, that person is apparently homeless. But secondly, what's significant from a philosophical standpoint? That person represents the Vijnani. Unlike the person who just sees the chameleon in one color, which means the Christian mystic seeing God as Christ or God the Father or Virgin Mary, or Vaishnavas seeing God as Krishna, or fanatical Ramakrishna devotees seeing God only as Ramakrishna. I hope that they don't exist, but they probably do. There is a unique person called the Vijnani who has experienced God, actually had spiritual realizations of God in different forms and aspects. Sri Ramakrishna is the best example because he actually practiced multiple religious paths and he realized God as Christ. He realized God as Allah. He realized God as Krishna, Sita, Hanuman. He realized his own true nature as non-dual pure consciousness when he practiced Advaitic sadhana under Totapuri. He realized the goal of Tantra under the guidance of Bhairavi Brahmani, right? And so the Vijnani is in a unique position because the Vijnani has a broader, more expansive knowledge of God. And so that person can teach a much broader understanding of the world religions, of the nature of God, than even realized souls. That's an important thing. We might think that once you realize God, all debates will cease and we'll all realize that we're all headed to the same goal. But no, realized souls argue with each other. There are, of course, realized Vaishnavas who staunchly feel that every other path is bogus. Just to quote Prabhupada, these are not my words, they're his words from 1970 Morning Walk. Look it up. Okay, second parable. Blind man and the elephant. Again, you're probably familiar with this, but there's a giant elephant. 5 blind men go to touch the elephant, but they're touching different parts of the elephant. One person touches the tail, says, yes, I know what the elephant's like, it's furry. And then another person's touching the trunk and saying, no, you're wrong, it's dry and scaly, and they all start fighting with each other. Again, there's one person who can see. And that person obviously can see the whole elephant. And again, that person intervenes and says, you're all right and you're all wrong. You're all right because you're touching different parts of the elephant. But you're wrong in generalizing on the basis of your particular perspective. You should not generalize based on your partial experience. And this is exactly what the Vijnani says. To all of these realized souls, notice they're all touching the elephant. That's a nice aspect of this parable that you don't get with the chameleon. They're not touching the chameleon, they're seeing the chameleon. But each blind man is actually touching the elephant. And one could, this might be reading too much into the parable, but I think one way of reading it is that even realized souls who have made contact with the higher reality, who have had a spiritual experience of God, even they can argue with each other and debate with each other and be kind of exclusivistic and say, no, God is only Christ, God is only Allah, God is only God is only Krishna, God is only Ramakrishna. And it's the Vijnani who's realized God in multiple forms and aspects who can correct them and say, no, you're all realizing different aspects and forms of the same infinite divine. Okay. Now, as I promised, I want to explain briefly, especially in the context of your question, excellent question, which is that you're right to point out that some other monks in our tradition do teach Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions and Vivekananda's harmony of religions in a more inclusivist way. If you want examples, we had some great scholarly monks in the tradition of Advaita Vedanta. 2 of them have written articles in Bengali defending this kind of interpretation. One of them in particular, his name is Swami Medhanandaji. Another one is Swami Omkarananda. But Medhanananda, he explicitly says, how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the world religions? On the basis of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And so the bhakti paths can take us part of the way, but ultimately they have to practice Dhyana Yoga, and only then can they realize the highest goal, which is not any kind of heaven, not the personal God, but not realizing their true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. And some of our monks do teach that. I think that's a mistake. You can see why I'm controversial in some circles. So, I'm not alone. I'm not the only monk who feels that the Advaitic inclusivist interpretation of our tradition is both mistaken and I think dangerous, because it really short shrifts the liberality and broadness of Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's views. Swami Tapasyanandaji, another great scholarly monk of our order, he wrote a wonderful book called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. And in the introduction to this book, he has a little 20 to 25 page introduction where he does a lot of interesting things. Number one, he points out the limitations of the traditional schools of Vedanta, including Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. And then at the end of his introduction, he explains how our spiritual tradition, the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition of Vedanta, harmonizes the apparently conflicting traditional schools of Vedanta. And there's a beautiful section there with the section heading, The Patronizing Attitude of Advaita Vedanta. And he uses the example of Mount Everest, the same metaphor used by Frank Morales to attack Sri Ramakrishna, but he's a follower of Sri Ramakrishna using the same Mount Everest. And here he's attacking Advaita Vedanta from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna. So we can use Mount Everest in many different ways. So Tapasaji says the Advaitins are standing at the peak of Mount Everest, in the high altitudes of Mount Everest, looking down at the base camp and saying, oh, you bhaktas, you're good, you're good. So you guys can hike up part of the way up to where we are, way up here. And if you're lucky, after many, many lifetimes of spiritual practice of your bhakti, you might have sufficiently pure and concentrated minds to then leave off your, what's ultimately sort of, the bhakti practices are meant for inferior aspirants. Once you become eligible to practice the highest path, which is the path of knowledge, once you're about halfway or 3/4 of the way up the hill, the mountain, sorry, it's not a hill, it's Mount Everest, the mountain, then you stop your bhakti, stop believing in the personal God, practice the path of knowledge, and then you can join us up here at the peaks, at this rarefied mountain peak, the peak of Mount Everest. So you can see high or lower here, it's very explicit, and I think Tapasanji is right in calling that attitude patronizing. And I think it's a real mistake for monks of our order to claim that, to try to fit Sri Ramakrishna's and Swami Vivekananda's teachings within this patronizing inclusivist framework. All right, I think I've said enough about his harmony of religions. Now I want to try to answer, in the remaining time, the 4 challenging questions that I raised at the beginning. But maybe to make things a little bit more interesting, but it's up to you, Mara. Maybe I can ask you guys how you might answer these questions before we make it more interactive at this point, and then I can give you my suggestions. So let me do that. So let me remind you of the questions, because I don't expect you to all have memorized the 4 questions. Let me go one by one, and then hear from you, and then I'll give my thoughts. First question. Remember, was Frank Morales's strongly worded objection to Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions? He says Sri Ramakrishna is just flat out wrong in thinking that all religions lead to the same goal, because every religion teaches a different goal. Christians teach a Christian heaven, the goal of Christian heaven. Muslims teach Jannah, which is a Muslim heaven. Vaishnavas teach a Vaishnava heaven, Goloka. Advaita Vedantins believe that the goal is not even any heaven at all, and so on and so forth. So you're wrong. Defend Sri Ramakrishna. Okay, Geeta first.
So what do we
do we have a mic for people who are online? Yeah, that'll be great.
So make specific, so the question is, how do you defend that?
Sri Ramakrishna against Frank Morales's objection that in fact there's not one goal that all religions lead to, but multiple goals. Each religion posits a different goal, and so Sri Ramakrishna is wrong.
I say that Ramakrishna's idea of the goal is much broader than that.
Hold it close to that.
Say it again.
His idea of the goal is much broader than that.
Very good, yeah.
And it includes all the aspects of the elephant.
Absolutely, I think that's wonderful. And I think that's exactly my response. Sri Ramakrishna, having practiced multiple religious paths, realized, of course he knew that different religions posit the goal in different ways. Of course he knew that. That's part of the reason why he practiced so many different religious traditions, to see whether that's true or not. And he found, lo and behold, that he's realizing different forms and aspects of the same infinite divine. And so his understanding of that divine is much broader than is found in most religious traditions. So he doesn't just accept a kind of narrowly Hindu understanding of heaven, or even within Hinduism, either Goloka or Vishnu Loka or Ramakrishna Loka, but he embraces all the heavens. How do we know this? And not just all the different heavens, but also he accepts the goal of Advaita Vedanta. There's an important teaching in the gospel when Mohima Chakraborty, who was a staunch follower of Shankara, so this inclusivist, you can see the inclusivism in his question actually. He says, I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? This is the patronizing attitude of Advaita Vedanta that Swami Tapasanji is talking about. Because he's saying, okay, it's all well and good. You're talking about bhakti, it's great. That's good for nursery school, but ultimately they have to get the PhD, which is Jnana Yoga. Don't they? They need nirvana too. Nirvana means here not the Buddhist nirvana, it's Advaitic nirvana, which means you dissolve your individual self in non-dual pure consciousness. The goal can't be some kind of heaven with the personal God. That can't be the goal. So even bhaktas have to practice our path ultimately. What is Sri Ramakrishna's answer? He says, it cannot be said that bhaktas need nirvana. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna is with his eternal bhaktas. Nitto Krishna ta nitto bhakto. Krishna is consciousness embodied, and his abode also is consciousness embodied. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. The Dhamma is the transcendental eternal heaven. That's eternal, and it itself is divine consciousness. So there's no question of it disappearing or getting sublated or dissolving at some future point in time. It's there for an eternity. And bhaktas are also eternal. Nitto bhakto, nitto Krishna, nitto bhakto. So that personal God is eternal. It's not sublated by non-dual pure consciousness. And the bhakta is also eternal. As Sri Ramakrishna used to put it, bhaktas want to eat sugar. Bhaktas don't want to become sugar. But he equally accepted both ideals. So the ideal, the goal of becoming sugar is the Advaitic ideal of resting in your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. He says, great, you'll have that. He's telling Advaitins that. What about Christians and Muslims and Sikhs and different theistic Hindus? He says, whatever heaven you believe in, you'll be going to that heaven. Because God lovingly has created different heavens for his bhaktas in different traditions. In fact, a devotee of Holy Mother came to Holy Mother and says, what's going to happen to us? I don't really want nirvana. I love you and I love Sri Ramakrishna. She says, don't worry. Ramakrishna has created Ramakrishna Loka for you. Tomader jonne Ramakrishna Lok toiri korechen. I talk about this, by the way, in a lecture I gave in Vedanta, New York, Savarp Energy Center, like last month, called Holy Mother Sharada Devi as a Philosopher. I go into more detail there about Holy Mother's teachings. Okay, so thank you so much, Geeta, because I think you hit the nail on the head, but maybe other people, have a take on it as well. Okay, I think you had your hand up first. So first you, and then I can go to, yeah.
There's also a question online.
Oh, okay. Okay, there's a question online about this question or about something else?
No, about this question. Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, ask.
Yeah. So,
Put it close to you.
would you consider Sri Ramakrishna's version of Vedanta as an amalgamation of Shaivism, Shankara Vedanta, and Advaita Vedanta of Vivekananda?
No. I can go into more detail, but yeah, no. So read chapter 1 of My Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. You'll understand what Vijnana Vedanta is. But even the word amalgam is just, it sounds like khichdi, which is a delicious Indian dish of mixing this philosophy with that philosophy. There are resonances with Advaita Vedanta. There are resonances with Kashmiri Shaivism. There are resonances with Vallabha Shuddha Advaita. But amalgamation is definitely the wrong term because it implies that there's it's a kind of hodgepodge philosophy, which I certainly don't think it is. It's a very sophisticated and rigorously worked out philosophy based on his own spiritual experiences. What Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta has in common with Advaita Vedanta is that he fully accepts the reality of non-dual pure consciousness, which is the goal of Advaita Vedanta. What he has in common with Vallabha Shuddha Advaita is that he also was a great bhakta and fully accepted the ideal of bhaktas, which is dwelling in some kind of eternal loka. What does his Vijnana Vedanta have in common with Kashmiri Shaivism? Many things. One of them is because Kashmiri Shaivism has a very expansive understanding of ultimate reality as Shiva, Shakti, Prakasha, Vyamashamaya, both Brahman and Shakti. He used to say Brahma, Shakti, Abhed. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable, but equally real aspects of the same reality, like fire and its power to burn. Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta also has in common with Kashmiri Shaivism, or at least has deep similarities with, his understanding of the world as a real manifestation of Shakti, rather than as something that's unreal. But I would not call that an amalgamation, because that implies that he accepts all the doctrines of the different schools and makes a kind of khichdi out of all of them, but I don't think that's what he does. Thank you. Yeah, you had your hand up, and then I'll come to you.
There are many paths. Just if you realize what you need to realize on all the paths, how will it help you right now? Is that the common goal?
I don't understand the question.
So there are many paths, and if you are going to realize what you need to realize on that path, how that will help you right now, is that the common goal?
I still don't understand the question. Can somebody else reformulate in a way that's clear?
Basically, there's all these different paths.
Yeah, but the goal is right now. What will help me find peace?
So how will understanding all that these different paths are
Oh,
leading to
I
the
see.
same goal?
Oh,
how
okay.
will it be peace?
Okay, how will, as far as I understand your question, which I think could be stated more clearly, is this, that, okay, I've just talked for an hour about the harmony of religions. How does it help us now as spiritual aspirants on a particular path? Is that the question?
That is the ultimate goal.
Put your mic up to your mouth.
That is the ultimate goal.
Yeah.
Where I want help right now,
Yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah.
So
Yeah, I'm hearing you say, isn't it the ultimate goal? Whatever works for me helps me
Yeah.
in this moment.
Yeah.
Isn't that the ultimate goal for all of us? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes. So go ahead and do it. But that's the beauty of what I've been teaching for the past hour, is that it empowers you to do that, to feel confident in your own path and not feel like, the problem with the inclusivist Advaitic explanation of our tradition is that it makes bhaktas feel bad and make them feel like, yeah, worship your Ramakrishna and do your japa, or worship your Krishna, worship your Christ. It's all good because
you're lower level.
you're in preschool now, you're lower level, but eventually you have to come up to my level. And so I'm not saying that, and I don't think Ramakrishna is saying that. So that's the idea, is that empowers you to kind of practice
Have
whatever.
you ever had any talk with any other, like, say, I work as a chaplain. So when I go and talk to other religions, they may use language that puts a superiority complex. I may feel bad. I may feel like there's a hierarchy. So what he's saying is that no, there is no hierarchy.
Yeah.
All right,
So that's one aspect. Now, there's a deeper answer to your question. I didn't get to this, but let me bring it up now in this context. I think another wonderful and unique feature of Sri Ramakrishna's distinctive form of religious pluralism is that he takes religious pluralism one step further and develops it into what I call religious cosmopolitanism. By which I mean that every spiritual aspirant, in whatever tradition that aspirant follows, some of us might be followers of Sri Ramakrishna, some of us might be Christians, some of us might be Muslims, every single one of us has something to learn from other religious traditions. And we should actively try to learn from other religious traditions. Fritjof Schuon was another religious pluralist, and he wrote a book called The Transcendent Unity of Religions. He's a Western, I think, more like a Sufi sort of a philosopher. And he made this wonderful statement once, I'm paraphrasing. He said that every religion is superior to every other religion in at least one respect. Put another way, every religion is able to express some truth better or explain some spiritual practice better than any other religion does. And if that's the case, then even if you're a Hindu, you can learn from Christianity and Islam. That's why Swami Vivekananda, in many of his lectures, he tried to capture what's the unique essence of every religion. Do you remember in some of his lectures, he talks about that. He says that the essence of Christianity is, I think he says service in one place, and love or something like that. The essence of Islam is brotherhood, this kind of democratic idea that everyone is equal in the eyes of God. The essence of Hinduism is, I can't believe that's the one I forgot, but no, he says the ideal is renunciation, I believe, is what he goes for, but I don't remember exactly. But in any case, but the idea is, each one of us as a religious cosmopolitan, so here's the way I'd put it, philosophically speaking, if you can accept religious pluralism and still not bother about any other religion, you can say, I'm fine on my path. And that's kind of the gist of your question, I think, right? And yeah, but let me continue. And so, but if you're a religious cosmopolitan, not just a religious pluralist, but a religious cosmopolitan, you will actively try to learn from other religious traditions. Swami Vivekananda in one of his lectures says, I will bow down with the Muslims in their mosque and pray to Allah. I will go to the Buddhist church and I don't think he says worship Buddha, but in any case, but revere the moral law or whatever. And I will go to the Hindu church, or the Hindu temple, and bow with the Hindus and blah blah blah. So what's the idea here? The idea is that we can enrich our own spiritual lives by learning about religious traditions other than our own, taking tips from other religions. To give you a simple example in our daily spiritual practice, we might find that Buddhist mindfulness techniques are very useful to incorporate into our own practice. We might find that the Christian emphasis on loving one's neighbor as oneself, or the Christian emphasis on service, or the Muslim emphasis, the word Islam means surrender. So it's a very beautiful philosophy of surrender, actually. Maybe we can take that idea and incorporate that into our religious practice. So anyway, so that, answer your question?
Yeah, so
Mike, to your mouth. Thank you.
Yeah, so basically I was defending Sri Ramakrishna's position of pluralism by saying that using the cosmopolitan approach that you described
Yeah.
in the present moment. That is the ultimate goal, because who knows what you will realize when you realize. Right now, if you realize the pluralism, you will find the peace on some part.
Yeah, okay, thank you for mentioning that, because I do want to add one cautionary note here, which is that Sri Ramakrishna did not encourage any of us to be religious dilettantes. The danger here is, let me dabble in Hinduism for a few days, then dabble in Baha'ism for a few days, and then Islam for a few days, and you'll never go deep in any tradition. That's not what he wanted. In fact, he used to warn against that, and he said, if you start digging in one place, and after 5 minutes, he says, I'm getting bored, and then you walk over another, like a five feet to your right and start digging there. He says, you're never going to dig deep. So what does it mean? What I think he means is, you have to have a deep grounding in your own faith tradition. And once you have that depth dimension, then you can add the breadth dimension, B-R-E-A-D-T-H, on the basis of that depth. That's why Swami Vivekananda used to say that Sri Ramakrishna was so unique, because he was as deep as the ocean and as wide as the infinite sky. But you can't have both at once, all at once. Otherwise, you're in danger of becoming a spiritual dilettante. So first, get a deep grounding in your own tradition, and then you can draw freely from other traditions and learn from them.
If you are following the path of Advaita, have you reached the depth?
Of course, in Advaita you have. Yeah, so I think she had a question, so let's give it, because we don't want you to monopolize the thing. Yeah.
Okay, so I would like to propose my hypothesis and hear what you think about it.
Yeah.
When you're talking about Mr. Morales and his model of there are many mountains, I'm always looking for the one theory of everything. So I always go back to two things that I just realized because of your talk are one thing. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. Each of those mountains is just a finger. None of them is the thing. They're pointing to the thing, and you can follow any of those fingers. The second is I was a linguistics major. And one of the things that came up in my studies a lot that seems so obvious, but I found hard for us to grasp. No word, no bit of language is the thing. It's just fingers pointing at the moon. No word can describe the ultimate.
Okay.
And so I think we get confused saying, oh no, it's this heaven. Oh no, it's that loka. Nirvana means this. No, it means that. I think the thing that it is, there is no word for, but we think that no, it's the Christian way or this kind of Hinduism or that kind of Hinduism, because we're confusing the words we use to label the thing with the thing itself.
Okay.
And so the hypothesis is there is no actual contradiction ultimately, but we're dealing with human minds which have limitations.
Yeah.
We're just not able to grasp the thing. And so we see it as the elephant's tail, the elephant's tusk, and think that we disagree with each other.
Okay, no, thank you. I mean, it's an interesting point. I sort of agree with it partially, but also disagree. And this is the part I disagree with. In philosophy of religion, especially in philosophical discussions of mysticism, they discuss two different ways of thinking of God, of the ultimate reality. One is called apophaticism, the other is called cataphaticism, K-A-T-A-P. What you're describing is something like a radical apophaticism, as far as I understand what you're saying, which is that the ultimate is fundamentally ineffable. And we can only kind of sort of like approximate or guess at what it really is. The danger of that position is that we're all wrong in a certain sense. And I don't want to go that far with apophaticism. And so I think what Sri Ramakrishna says is that there is an apophatic dimension to God. That's why in one of his wonderful teachings, he says, Tini nirakar shakar abar kotoki, which means God is with form and impersonal, with form and personal, without form and impersonal, and much more besides. This much more besides might capture this kind of ineffability thing that you're talking about. But that doesn't mean that God is just sheerly radically ineffable, and that there aren't genuine, real, authentic, experienceable aspects of God as well. So I think there's also an importantly cataphatic dimension to God in Sri Ramakrishna's understanding.
Now what's the cataphatic?
God actually manifests to Christian mystics as Christ and as God the Father. God, that infinite divine, that ineffable divine, actually manifests to Muslims as Allah. That infinite divine actually manifests to Vaishnavas as Krishna. That infinite divine actually manifests to Ramakrishna devotees as Ramakrishna. That infinite divine actually manifests, I don't even know if manifest is right, but manifests its non-dual aspect as pure consciousness to Advaita Vedantins. That same infinite divine manifests to Buddhists as Nirvana. And if you push the ineffability too far, you end up kind of reducing all of these different conceptions of the ultimate to kind of like a lesser reality, or kind of, and that's the danger. Does that make sense? And in fact, there's one Western philosopher of religion who actually does that, I think. And I talk about this in chapter 4 of my book, Infinite Past and Infinite Reality, the British philosopher John Hick, because he has a conception of the ultimate as the real an sich. And so any of you are familiar with German philosophy, the Ding an sich is the term that Kant uses. The thing in itself, to refer to the ultimate reality. And then he says, but unfortunately, because of the limitations of the human mind, we can't ever know what that Ding an sich is, the thing in itself is. And so the danger of what you're saying is that, well, so we can only kind of point to the ultimate, but we don't actually get any real knowledge of the absolute. But I don't think that's what Shram is saying. Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
But thank you, it's a wonderful point, yeah.
Sorry,
Yeah, go ahead. No.
So, the Krishna has a view about the same goal.
About the same guru?
Same goal.
Mm-hmm.
The goal is not about heaven, nirvana, or enlightenment, but putting an end in seeking material happiness and remain in peace always. So, all religions may give a possibility about forms and parts, but they all agree to end material happiness and just stay in bliss.
I couldn't hear the first part. So, as far as I understand the question, all religions seem to posit a kind of unending, limitless bliss as the goal. Is that correct?
Yeah. And material suffering.
And the end of material suffering. Yeah. The only problem with that is being blissful seems to imply a subject, the persistence of a subject. You have to enjoy bliss or experience bliss. But some traditions say that the very subjecthood of the subject is actually dissolved in the final state. Advaita Vedanta doesn't actually believe that there's a final blissful state. I mean, if you really push Advaitins on this, they're not going to accept the idea of a blissful state, because that implies an experiencer of bliss. But they're saying there is no experiencer. There's no subject and object. There's just non-dual Brahman. So that's why I think the questioner is wrong. Thank you. Yeah.
I had a question. You talk about some traditions seeking a dualistic loka. And so then I picture these various mountains, a range of mountains with various heights.
Right.
And so it's as if they all have different goals, different peaks to attain. And then, of course, fall short. So they're not aspiring to this ultimate non-dual consciousness. They probably all enjoy bliss, and they're perfectly content on their little mountaintop. For those who reach that summit of their tradition, and that's as far as they're going to go.
Right, but you're using the language of Frank Morales here, right? Because there aren't different mountaintops on Ramakrishna's view. There's just one, and the peak of that one mountain is the Christian heaven, but it's also the Vaishnava heaven, it's also the Ramakrishna Loka, it's also Advaita Vedanta, it's also the Buddhist Nirvana. So there aren't different mountains. I think what you're voicing is the Frank Morales objection to our tradition, but what I've been trying to explain is how our tradition differs from Morales' picture of the different world religions. Yeah, thank you. You might agree with Morales, but that's up to you. I agree with Ramakrishna. Yeah, Gita.
Srima's talking about Ramakrishna Loka.
Yeah.
Sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
But I have a question about it.
Yeah.
I've always heard that the only time we grow spiritually is when we're in a physical body. And Ramakrishna also has said that there is no end to God realization. And so I would think that no matter what we experience spiritually, what mountaintop we get to, we can always go further. And so if we stay in a loka where we're no longer incarnated, wouldn't we stop, our spiritual growth stop?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you're right that Sri Ramakrishna would sometimes say there's no end to God, to realizing God. But the thing is, he also distinguished different types of soul. And he would say that there are ordinary souls, jiva-kotis, and there are ishvara-kotis, divinely commissioned souls. And what are ishvara-kotis? He specifically gives a definition in one place. He says, avatar ba avatar and angsha. Avatars, so this is super high level stuff, incarnations of God, or those who are born as portions of an incarnation. And who are the ones who can attain vijnana? Ishvara-kotis. Who are the ones who can go beyond even one narrow ideal and further experience, other kind of salvific ideals? The vijnanis, basically. But that's not the majority of us. So there are differences between soul and soul. So that's part of the answer to your question. And he would often also say, to touch the Ganges, do you have to start by going up to the source in Gomukh and say, okay, I'm going to start at the top of the source of the Ganga and then drag my finger all the way down to South India to Kanyakumari? And no, he says, you touch the Ganges at any point and you've touched the Ganges. And he says, in the same way, you don't need to realize every aspect of God in order to have realized God. You can realize whatever favorite aspect of God that you love. He also gives the example of the ant in the sugar hill. And he says, an ant, a cocky ant, goes to a hill of sugar, takes one grain of it, that goes to his head. And he says, next time I'm going to go and take the whole hill. Nobody can take the whole hill. There's no ant, none of us, not even the Ishvara-koti ants, can take the whole hill. That means nobody can realize the infinitude of the infinite divine. Some may be lucky enough, not lucky, and whatever it is, but blessed enough to realize 2 or 3 aspects of the divine, of the infinite divine. Others are perfectly happy with the one aspect. Another example, the washerman. There's a washerman with this very interesting tub of dye, and one person comes up to the washerman. The washerman says, what color do you want your cloth to be dyed in? They say, I want yellow. It's one dye. Keep in mind, there aren't multiple dyes like multiple mountains. There's one tub of dye. Dips it, hands a yellow shirt to that guy. Next person, I want it red. Same tub of dye, comes out red. Goes on, hundreds of people coming and going. One person comes, very unusual person. And the washerman says, what color do you want me to dye your cloth in? He says, I want you to dye my cloth in the color of your dub, the tie dub. Tub dye. Sorry, tongue twister. Tub dye. It's very interesting. That person is a Vijnana, the Ishvara-koti, the one who revels in different forms and aspects of God, who wants the universal dye. He loves to think of God in different forms and aspects, but that's a very rare soul. That would be my answer. And for those who are content with Christ or Allah, let them be content. Why force them to gorge themselves? Sri Ramakrishna used to call himself a spiritual glutton, a glutton in the... Do we all have to be gluttons? No. Yeah, thank you.
Swami, I think at this point, what I'd like you to do is that I'd like you to answer the three other questions.
Okay.
You have, right? No more questions right now. I want to hear his
All
answers.
right, she wants my answers.
All religions lead to the
He's
same
putting it,
goal.
Maharaj's putting his foot down.
Conflicting scriptures and nirvana. Let's go.
All right,
Done within 10 minutes.
like it. Decisive and yes. All right, second challenging question. What would Sri Ramakrishna say about self-styled, religiously inspired terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Om Shinrikyo? How do we exclude these from his Harmony of Religions? Here's how I understand it. I think on his understanding, he would not actually count these terrorist paths as genuine religious paths. But now the question is why? On what grounds? And so one thing that you'll find in the gospel is that he often insists that any true spiritual path has to prescribe ethical and spiritual practices which have the aim of eliminating egoism and selfishness. In Bengali, he would say, Ami mole ghuchibe jonjal, which means all trouble cease when selfishness and the ego dies. Now, there's a wonderful incident. I don't know if it's wonderful, but it's an interesting incident in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. When in Dakshineshwar, a monk comes to visit, not to visit him, but he's in the area. And Sri Ramakrishna hears a funny thing about this sannyasi, which is that he's having an affair with a woman, which you're not supposed to do if you're a monk. And he approaches that monk and he says, what's this I hear that you're doing these things with this woman? And he says, oh, let me explain. He's an Advaita Vedantin. If the whole world is unreal at all times, how can my fall alone be real? And then Sri Ramakrishna says, I said in utter disgust, I piss on your Vedanta. It's such strong language that it was censored out of Chaitananda's divine play, you know, and he changes it to, I think it's either him or the previous translator. I spit on your Vedanta, because it's like too much for maybe thought Westerners to take, but no, come on, we can, yeah. So, but he felt so strongly about this as a fraudulent path. So that's another example of a kind of a path that's not a path. You might think it's a path. Advaita Vedanta is a wonderful path, of course it is, but this person is corrupting, abusing, degrading Advaita Vedanta. And by doing so, he's disqualifying the Advaita Vedanta as at least his form of Advaita Vedanta is certainly not a path. And therefore he pisses on that Vedanta. You see, he's not pissing on Advaita Vedanta, he's pissing on his Vedanta, his weird form of Vedanta, which justifies all sorts of unethical practices. I think you would say exactly the same thing about Muslim-inspired ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They'll say that's not the true Islam. Anytime you're preaching violence and engaging in violence, that's not, you're deviating from the teachings of Islam, and so on and so forth. That's my answer to challenging question number 2. What about challenging question number 3? This is about the problem of conflicting religious truth claims. Different religions often say conflicting things about the nature of ultimate reality, about historical facts, like whether Christ died on the cross, whether rebirth is true. Here, I think that Sri Ramakrishna's answer is a subtle one, and we have to distinguish 2 different types of conflicting religious truth claim. One is conflicting claims about the nature of ultimate reality. What is the nature of the ultimate reality? And of course, we know, as Frank Morales points out very nicely, that different religions have different understandings of the ultimate, right? What does Sri Ramakrishna say? It's exactly what Gita pointed out, which is that they seem to be conflicting, but in fact they're complementary. Just as the blind men are touching different parts of the same elephant, the Christian is realizing the Christian aspect, the Christ aspect of the personal God, or God the Father aspect of the personal dimension of the infinite divine. Vaishnavas are realizing the Krishna form of the Shakti aspect of the infinite divine. Advaita Vedantas are realizing the impersonal aspect of the same infinite divine as non-dual pure consciousness. But what seem to be conflicting claims about the nature of the ultimate reality turn out to be complementary from Sri Ramakrishna's more expansive standpoint of Vijnana. But there's another kind of conflicting truth claim about, as I said, historical and metaphysical truths. Rebirth is a kind of metaphysical doctrine. Are we reborn? Yes or no? Did Christ die on the cross is an example of a historical doctrine. If somebody was there right before 0 CE, and with a video camera, we could have just verified whether Christ actually died on the cross or not. And there has to be a fact of the matter. Yes or no? Either we're reborn or not. So either Abrahamic religions are right about it, or Buddhism and Hinduism and Sikhism are right about it, and Jainism. Either Christ died on the cross or not. And if Christ did die on the cross, then Islam is wrong and Christianity is right. If Christ didn't die on the cross, Islam is right and Christianity is wrong. So there has to be a fact of the matter about some conflicting truth claims. What Sri Ramakrishna says about those conflicting truth claims, you see how that's different from truth claims about ultimate reality, which are complementary. He doesn't say that in cases where there has to be a fact of the matter that they're all true, because that wouldn't make sense. He'd be committing himself to contradictions. Yes, Christ did die on the cross, but you're also right, Muslims. Christ didn't die on the cross. Yes, you Hindus and Buddhists are right. There is rebirth. You Christians and Muslims are right. There's no rebirth. That's nonsense. He would be speaking nonsense. That's not what he says. What does he say? Let me read to you from the gospel. That yearning is the whole thing. Dakolata in Bangla. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahma. Brahma means followers of the Brahma Samaj. The vital point is yearning. God is our inner guide, Antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path, only you must be restless for him. God himself, I want to translate, this is Nicola, I'm going to retranslate it as herself. God herself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks his watch is right, but as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right. But that doesn't hamper one's work. This is, I think, this contains in a nutshell his response to these other kinds of conflicting truth claims about historical truths and about metaphysical truths.
Swami, can you say where he said that?
Well, it's in the gospel. I mean, I can look up it's definitely in the gospel.
But would you say that the main thing then is that these are more intellectual type of ideas? So regarding your spiritual life, it really doesn't have much of a bearing, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, let me unpack it and then yeah. So let me explain my understanding of this passage. First of all, he's saying that no religion is free from errors. That's an important fact, actually. No watch tells exactly the right time. These days with smartphones and smartwatches, it sort of does, but let's go back to the 19th century when. So that means even Hinduism, his own home tradition, no, even that has errors. But the thing is, when it comes to historical truth claims about historical matters, like whether Christ died on the cross, and about metaphysical claims other than claims about the nature of ultimate reality, that's the important qualification here. They don't handicap you, even if you're wrong about certain things, that doesn't handicap you from the standpoint of salvation. It doesn't handicap your religious path as an effective path to the goal of your religion. That's the basic idea. So let's say that rebirth just is true. Hindus and Buddhists and Jainas, they're all right. Rebirth is true. Abrahamic religions don't believe in rebirth. So does that mean that it's a less effective path, that Abrahamic religions are less effective than Hindu? No. Because it's not essential to their worldview and to their spiritual path. And they don't need, that doesn't play a role in their spiritual philosophy. And it doesn't need to. That's the basic idea. So do you see how that answer is like fundamentally different from his answer to conflicting claims about the nature of ultimate reality? His answer to, Christians saying God is Christ, and Muslims saying God is Allah, and Vaishnavas saying God is only Krishna, and this and that. Vaishnavas actually don't say God is just Krishna, by the way. So there is an inclusivist dimension to Vaishnavism, which is that they have a very elaborate eschatology, and they have names for different heavens, but they're hierarchical. And so the highest heaven is Goloka, and it's infinitely blissful because you dwell with Krishna. And then there are other lower lokas. There's one with Shiva in it, and then there's one with even lower one with Durga. And so there are all these there's a higher and lower kind of scheme. So there you get an inclusivist kind of thing. But when Prabhupada starts talking about bogus, that becomes more exclusivistic. So that's why I say that Vaishnavas kind of straddle the border between exclusivism and inclusivism. Okay, so that's my answer to the third challenging question. And the fourth challenging question is so challenging that it would actually take me a while to answer it. And so I don't think I have time. My father actually, after watching a version of this lecture, said you should give a separate lecture on Sri Ramakrishna and Buddhism, and I think that's a good idea. But anyway, because this is the question of how does Sri Ramakrishna accommodate Buddhism within his doctrine of the harmony of religions? It's a whole can of worms. And if I only have 2 minutes, I don't think I'll be able to answer it.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Give us the essence.
Well, I'll try. So we need to distinguish. You can't generalize about Buddhism. That's the first thing. That's the first step in at least moving in the right direction. Let's distinguish at least 3 different aspects of Buddhism. One is the Buddha's teachings. And of course, nobody can go back in time and actually hear what the Buddha said. But what we have is the Tipitaka, which is the Pali text, supposedly recording Buddha's teachings. Not everybody accepts it, but most Buddhist traditions accept it as authentic. And so if we take the Tipitaka to be representative of the Buddha's teachings, that's one question we can ask. How do we reconcile or fit the Buddha's teachings within Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of the harmony of religions is one question. Second question is, what about Theravada Buddhism? This is a tradition which explicitly denies any kind of eternal self. It's just a fact. There's no way around it, even for Vedantins. You can't somehow finagle Theravadins to accept some kind of higher self. They don't. It's a fact. And so how do you end up accounting for that? Third is Mahayana Buddhism. So let's distinguish these 3. First, with Buddha's teachings. Sri Ramakrishna actually never talks about Buddhism anywhere in the gospel, but he does talk about Buddha. So let me read to you a passage from the gospel where he talks about Buddha. He says, Buddha was not an atheist. He simply could not express the reality in words. Do you know what Buddha means? By meditating on one's own Bodha Swarupa, one's true nature as pure consciousness, one becomes that Bodha Swarupa. Notice the becoming sugar kind of resonance here. It's like Advaita Vedanta. Why should Buddha be called an atheist? When one realizes one's Swarupa, true nature, one's true nature as a self, one attains a state that is something between asti and nasti. It's a very philosophically precise statement. Between asti means is and nasti means is not. Nastik keno nastik noy mukhe bolte pare nai. Buddha ki jano? Bodh swarup ke chinta kore kore tai hoa. Bodh swarup hoa. So now, what Sri Ramakrishna is clearly doing is assimilating Buddha to Advaita Vedanta, the Buddha's teachings to Advaita Vedanta, saying that even though Buddha couldn't express it in words, what he's calling nirvana in a strictly negative way is nothing but non-dual pure consciousness. It's becoming sugar. And you might say, well, that's exactly what some critics criticize him for, because he's turning Buddha into a Vedantan, which is not accurate. Why don't you let Buddha be Buddha? But some scholars, and this is why it takes time to kind of go into the details here. There are a number of scholars who actually defend this kind of understanding of the Buddha's teachings, and they point to certain teachings that Buddha is found in the Tipitaka. I'll give you 2 examples. I'll just stop with the Buddha because we don't have time. So Sanyutta Nikaya in the Tipitaka, Vachagota asks Buddha, is there a self? And Buddha, this is written, the Buddha remains silent. And then Vachagota asks the Buddha, then is there no self? So he first took the silence to mean there's no self. Then is there no self? Am I right to read your silence? And the Buddha remains silent again. Which means neither is true or it doesn't matter. I mean, something like that. It's like, we don't know. But in any case, he seems to leave room open for a higher self, something like non-dual pure consciousness. But an even more interesting passage from the Tipitaka, this is from the Khuddaka Nikaya. He says, monks, there is a not born, a not become, a not made, a not compounded. Monks, if that unborn, not become, not made, not compounded were not, there would be apparent no escape from this here that is born, become, made, compounded. He says you have to posit a transcendental reality in order to ground the possibility of escaping from this hell of samsara, this conditioned world of pratitya-samutpada, of conditioned existence. There has to be something unconditioned in order to escape from this conditioned world, this world of conditioned entities. And so he seems to be giving an argument for the existence of some transcendental reality. And so then that leaves room open for a Ramakrishnan kind of interpretation of the Buddhistic nirvana as a state of non-dual pure consciousness. And we can stop there, or I can go on to explain Theravada and Mahayana.
Then what about the interpretation of the extinction, nirvana, meaning the extinction here of everything? I mean, non-extinction of the soul, so.
Well, no, but the thing is that's not what Maharaj just said, is that what about the Buddhist view of nirvana as the extinction of everything? I don't think all Buddhists say that nirvana is the extinction of everything. No. Some will say that it's the snuffing out of the individual self. Yeah. Of what?
Desires.
There are different ways of cashing it out. Actually, different schools of Buddhism explain nirvana in different ways, actually. Right. It literally means snuffing out. And in fact, in Bengali, you could say nebano. It means like snuffing out a candle. But what is the light that's being snuffed out is actually there's some differences even within the Buddhist schools and across the Buddhist schools. One understanding of nirvana in Buddhism, especially Theravada, is nirvana is nothing but escape from rebirth. So that's one way of explaining it. Another one is dissolution of any kind of individual consciousness. But that leaves room for a kind of universal consciousness, because Advaita Vedantins also accept nirvana in that sense, because they're going to say you don't exist in the highest state any longer as Medhananda or as Harinamananda, but as just non-dual pure consciousness. But there are other schools, more radical schools of Buddhism, which do, like Shunyata. They have this. Some schools of Mahayana Buddhism uphold the ideal of realizing Shunyata, which is a kind of emptiness, voidness. And there you might push the line that it's literally like nothing is left. In fact, there's one Hindu school which teaches that the highest state of salvation is actually a state of unconsciousness. It's like being as unconscious as a stone, which is very interesting. It's a school of Nyaya philosophy. So Hinduism is like so vast that it encompasses everything. It's very interesting. One thing I wanted to mention, which is interesting, is that Swamiji was asked about this. You are talking about Advaita, but how do you accommodate Buddhism? In a February 1897 interview, he's asked this question: what is the notion of mukti according to the Advaita philosophy? Or in other words, is it a conscious state? Is there any difference between the mukti of the Advaitism and the Buddhistic nirvana? Direct question. His answer: there is a consciousness in mukti, which we call superconsciousness. It differs from your present consciousness. It is illogical to say that there is no consciousness in mukti. The Buddhistic nirvana must have the same degree of consciousness, whatever the Buddhists may say. Our definition of mukti is affirmative in its nature, while the Buddhistic nirvana has a negative definition. So if I had more time, I would explain in more detail how I think Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji would just bite the bullet on Theravada Buddhism and certain schools of Mahayana Buddhism, which posit a kind of non-transcendental reality, or something like they don't posit any kind of ultimate reality. And what they would say is, even though you insist that there is no ultimate reality, we insist that through your Buddhist path, which is a perfectly valid path, you will ultimately realize that you're realizing non-dual pure consciousness. I'm saying biting the bullet because they're not honoring the strictly negative understanding of the ultimate. You don't even say the ultimate in the case of Theravada because they don't believe in an ultimate, but they don't accept their goal at face value. And I think that's the price they have to pay for embracing the harmony of religions. But why is that bullet worth biting? Because they do that in order to accept Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism as equally effective paths leading to the goal of the highest goal, basically. Does that make sense? So if they don't bite that bullet, they can't actually accept those paths as they can't even accommodate it within the orbit of the harmony of religions. They're gonna have to say you lose out, you miss the way. And instead of saying that, they're going to say you can reach the highest goal through your path, except that the way you characterize the goal now is ultimately you're going to find that that's not fully accurate. Okay. Thank you.
Swamiji. Thank you. I'll have to have you back part 2.
Yeah, just on Buddhism or something. Yeah.
Like Sumanasana's.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah.
So
should we close with a mantra?
We'll do a chat. I think we'll be late now. So let me just make a couple. One announcement at least. Next week and the following week, there'll be no lectures. So we're going to be having a 4-day retreat beginning Thursday through Sunday, and it's already been filled up. So that's going to be for those that have signed up for that retreat. And then the following week is sort of recovery week from that week. So for the next 2 weeks, we'll have no lectures here at the San Diego Monastery, meaning no Saturday talks. And then we'll resume again after that.
Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Thank you everyone for the wonderful interaction. I really appreciate that. Yeah.
Want to go to the backyard? And
Sure.
get and greet us?